Hi everybody, it's Courtney. I'm here with another design team project for Trinity Stamps. Today I'm going to be making a set of note cards. I'm going to be using the Winter Botanical stamp set as well as a sentiment from the Hello Sweet Friend. So I have 5 pieces of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock here, and these are all cut down with a stitched rectangle die. And you certainly don't need a stamp positioner for this, but it does make life a lot easier. So I'm taking the largest floral in the Winter Botanical stamp set, and I'm going to go ahead and place that towards the left-hand side, kind of towards the top of the panel, and stamp that with my blackout ink by Ink on 3. Rotate my panel 180 degrees and stamp that again. And then I'll just take another panel and do the same thing so I can get all 5 panels done so that my flowers are in the same exact spot each time. Next, I took a piece of full stick Post-it note tape and I went ahead and placed that directly over where I had stamped my flowers and then stamped that twice as well. I'm going to go ahead and fussy cut these out, and now I'm only creating 2 masks. I found that the 2 masks did last for all of my stamping, but just keep in mind that sometimes your ink can seep through if you stamp over it too many times. So you may, if you see this happening, you may have to end up cutting another mask. So I went ahead and fussy cut this, and as you can see, I'm cutting right along the black line, pretty much turning the paper with my left hand and keeping my scissors straight with my dominant hand, which for me is my right hand. Then I'll go ahead and place that directly over the images, and you could probably get away with 1 mask, but I just didn't want to have to keep repositioning it each and every time. So just having 2 made it a little bit easier for me. Once my masks were cut and placed down over my stamped image, I'm going to go ahead and take one of the leaf stamps as well as one of these little sprig looking things. And I kind of played around with which one I wanted to use. I was originally going to use one of the smaller buds and decided that was just a little bit too small. So I ended up using one of these little sprigs that looks like it may be some sort of berries on the top of it. And then I'll go ahead and stamp that with that same blackout ink. Now I'm stamping my images twice just to make sure I get a bold black outline, but you certainly don't need to do that. Again, flipping my panel 180 degrees and restamping that twice again. Then I'll just carefully remove my masks and place them down onto my next panel and then stamp those 2 images in the same spot on the rest of the 4 panels as well. Once those were stamped out, I will reposition. I'm going to take that little sprig of berries off here, and I'm going to take that same leaf stamp and just reposition that so that I have another leaf on the other side of my flower. Again, using the same masks. I'm not cutting new ones at this point, being I'm going to be stamping on a different part of the flower. I didn't have any problem with it seeping through. But again, just going through and stamping on all 5 of my panels, just removing my masks each time. Now I did find that I was losing the stick on them, but they were sticky enough to still stay in place. Just keep in mind that sometimes the photopolymer on the stamps can be a little sticky sometimes too, and it may shift around your mask. So before you stamp that the second time, just be sure that your mask is still in place. So once all of my stamping or my images were stamped out, I'm going to go ahead and use one of these, or actually 2 of the sentiments from the Hello Sweet Friend stamp set. And this is just going to be a set of note cards that I can give to a friend or family member. And I'm just going to place that, kind of played around with the placement and used 2 of the sentiments to center that in between my little flowers and leaves there. And I'm going to be using a variety of different Distress Oxide inks for my sentiment, because although each one of these cards are pretty much going to be the same, they are going to be different colors. So for the first one, I'm going to be using the Dusty Concord, and I did stamp my sentiment twice as well, just to make sure I get a great impression. Cleaned off my stamp And then I'll go ahead and take my next panel and just continue to stamp this with the different color Distress Oxides. Next is the Seedless Preserve, doing that the same way. This is a purple, but it has a little bit of a pink to it. So it was different enough from the Dusty Concord where I could use both of them in the same set. Next, I'm going to be using the Picked Raspberry, which is a very bright pink. Again, stamping that twice. And then I will move on to the Mermaid Lagoon. And you'll just want to make sure that your stamp is clean each time. You will get a pretty good impression with the Distress Oxides, much better than you will with traditional Distress inks. But if that is what you have, especially with the stamp positioner, you can certainly use those as well, being you can stamp it as many times as you'd like. Finishing off this last panel with Wild Honey, stamping that twice. And I did let these dry just a little bit because the Distress Oxides do take a little bit of time. I did give it a minute or two before I moved on to the next step. And I'm going to be taking my T-square ruler. First, I fixed up a fingerprint that I had on this particular panel. I'm just using a Tombow sand eraser for that. And I'm going to be taking my T-square ruler and an EK Success journaling pen, which is a Copic safe pen, but you don't need to use a Copic safe pen being I'm not going to be Copic coloring the background. And I'm just going to basically draw a square or a rectangle around my images, but stopping at my images, if that makes any sense. So basically, I'm just framing in this sentiment and just going around each one of the stamped images. I'm not measuring here, so each card is going to be slightly different than the other just because I'm lazy and I didn't want to take the time to measure. But for the most part, they're going to be pretty similar to one another. I did that with all 4 panels, again, just kind of starting off around the same area for each of the leaves and then just connecting the other 4 sides, or the other 2 sides, I should say. And then once I finished that, we will move on to the Copic coloring. And I did pick Copic markers that closely matched my sentiment colors, or the colors that the Distress Oxide ink colors. So I'm going to show you the first card, and then I'll go through and show you the color combinations that I used. I'm keeping the coloring super simple on this. So I started with my lightest color to map out my darkest areas and just to get my paper saturated a little bit. Then I'll go in with the darkest color, and I'm just putting a few little flicks on the center or in the base of the middle, the front panels, or the front petals. And then the petals behind that, I'm just going to create a shadow where they lay behind the ones in the front. Blending that out with the B05. And flicking those areas out even further, almost to the very tip of the petals with the B02. And then I'll finish back off with that B00 and just fill in the rest of the petals. Now I will take one of my midtones for each one of these to fill in my little berries. For this one, I used the B05 just because I felt like that was the one that best matched that Mermaid Lagoon. For the leaves, I'm going to start off again with my lightest color just to map out those darkest areas, which will be right there in the center of the leaf and then where it's kind of tucked behind the flower. I'm also going to create little V's where the leaf is kind of indented on itself. And I did go in with my darkest color for these little V's, but I didn't like the way it turned out. So for the remainder of the cards, I colored them the same way. And I did use my G28, but just for the center of the leaf, I didn't use it for those little V's. I started that with the G07. So just because it's a dark area doesn't mean you have to use your very darkest color each and every time. But I'm blending these areas out each time with the G07, then the G03, and then I will finish off and go back to that YG03 and fill in the rest of the leaf. And like I said, I colored everything the same way except skipping that G28 for those little notches. But I'm going to show you the color combinations that I used for each and every one. So for the Picked Raspberry, I'm going to be using some RV markers, coloring the flower the same exact way. I didn't get a whole lot of contrast on this one. I probably should have picked a darker color for my shadow color, but it's fine. I didn't want to use more than 4 colors just because the coloring on this is extremely simple. I'm coloring the little berries on this one with the RV06, which is the darkest mid-tone. I pretty much stuck to that as long as it closely matched the Distress Oxide ink color. And then again, finishing that off with the highlight color just for the very tips of each one of the petals. Next, we'll move on to the next panel here, and this is the Seedless Preserves. And I'm going to be using my V01 as my highlight color, V09 as my darkest color, which is it's a pretty dark purple. So I'm just using this pretty sparingly. The V06 is very close to the Seedless Preserves, so I'm going to flick that out pretty far. I want this to be my main color, and I'm also going to use this for the little berries there. I'll go ahead and extend that out with the V04, and then I will finish off with the V01, just blending those colors out a little bit. Now, certain color combinations, you're going to kind of reserve some of those flick lines, which I'm fine with. It does give some texture to the petals, but others, you may lose those depending on how much you blend and what color combination that you use. So next we'll move on to the, which one is this? Dusty Concord. And I'm going to be using some more V markers for this. My V000 will be my highlight. V17 is going to be my shadow color, again flicking that right in the center of the petals and where the petals lay behind the other. V15 will be my darkest mid-tone, also the color for those little berries, which I did initially forget, but I do go back and fill those in, and I'm not doing any shading. They're just a dot. Finishing off the tips of the petals back to that V000, and then this is where I realized I forgot my little berries, so I'll go back in and fill that area in as well. Next, we'll move on. This is the final panel here, moving on to the yellows, I guess you could say. My Y04 is super bright, as you can see, but this is just my highlight color. So this isn't the actual color of the image. Neither is the YR68. This is just my shadow color, which is a lot more orange than the sentiment. The Y38 is very close to the Distress Oxide ink color. So this is going to be pretty much my main color of my image. Your highlight and your shadow will never be the color of your image. It's just to get contrast, basically. So I did use that Y38 for those little berries just to closely match that sentiment. Once all of my coloring was done, and I did go ahead and color in all those leaves the same way as I did the first minus the G28, I'm going to use my Tombow Mono Multi-Glue to adhere each one of these panels onto a piece of black cardstock that is cut just slightly larger than the panel itself. I just want a very small border around each one of these just to make the black outline pop a little bit more in the cards. And then I will go ahead and take that same Tombow Mono Multi-Glue to adhere each one of these to a side folding A2 size white note card. And you'll just want to, I use the wet glue just because I can move it around if I need to. I'm not great at centering things the first time around. So the wet glue gives me an extra minute or so to be able to reposition it if I need to, where if you use a tape runner or a double-sided adhesive, sometimes once it's down, it's down. So even though the Tombow Mono Multi-Glue does dry fairly quickly for being a wet glue, it still does give me enough time to fix any errors that I may have or fix any crookedness, I guess you could say. So once I had all of my panels down onto their card bases here, I wanted these to be very plain and simple, but I wanted to add a little bit of dimension. So I'm taking black Nuvo drops to fill in the centers of the flowers. I squirt a little bit out onto a scrap piece of paper, and that's honestly just a piece of the Post-it note tape that I had cut off from cutting those masks. And I just make sure that there's no air bubbles in there before I bring them to the card. Sometimes if you do have an air bubble and you squeeze the bottle, it's kind of gonna spray onto your card. And of course this is black, so I didn't want that to happen because I would have never gotten it off. Next, I'll take the Morning Dew Nouveau Drops, which these are clear. They dry clear. They're a little cloudy in the beginning, but they will dry clear. And I just went over the little berries that we had colored in just to give these a little bit of texture. You'll still see the color that we colored these. Once it's dry, you'll still see it through perfectly, but it will take probably about an hour or so to dry. Make sure that you don't stack them on top of one another right away because they will stick to each other and the Nouveau drops will kind of flatten out. So here are the 5 cards that we created today. Thank you guys so much for stopping by and have a great day. Bye.